But how about putting the finishing touches on your writing now? So you've been writing, you planned your draft, you organized it, you figured out how to creatively agree and disagree with your sources to really engage them. You work through writer's block, you're still writing. Now you're getting to the end, you want to put on the finishing touches. Yay, you're almost done. Okay, so first of all, write your introduction and conclusion last. All right, we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then what to look for when revising. Okay, so writing your introduction last. Well, it would make sense that you write your conclusion last, but why would you write your introduction last? Especially since you've got, the whole outline that you've made, right? You with all the sections and the subsections and figuring out which sources you're going to use where. If you've already made a very explicit outline to begin with, why would you bother writing your introduction last? It would make sense that you would write your introduction first so that you know where you're going. Well, you never really know completely where you're going, even when you have a very good outline. Why? Because you have to allow for and I did mention this in the previous video, but I'll say it again. It's really worth saying again. You have to allow for maybe not huge major alterations, but certain alterations in your outline, because the writing process itself, first of all, it helps one to remember things, right? But it also helps one to think, to understand, and make previously unnoticed connections. And these are ideas that perhaps would not have come to you at the outline stage, at the draft, when you're just writing your original sort of draft outline. And you might not have thought of that. You have these connections in your head at that point, but the writing process itself brings out nuances in your ideas, and then suddenly you're getting all these new connections that you wouldn't have thought of just in the outline form, and maybe some of them take you in a slightly different direction. Okay, so you have to allow for alterations in your outline. That's why you want to write your introduction last, because your introduction should point your reader through. Your introduction is basically saying, okay, it's like a roadmap showing you where you're going to go through the thesis or through the paper. But if you change the direction in the middle of the paper, then you're going to have to go back to the introduction and rewrite it. So you may as well just, save it to last anyway, right? It also helps you to become more objective in the evaluation of your own thoughts. You might think you have a fantastic idea, which is really justified, but as you're writing and you're engaging the authors, your sources, you might find that, wow, maybe your idea was not as sound as you thought, or maybe your argument against a particular source was not as strong of an argument as you thought. So you might have to change that too, right? It also helps you to develop new frameworks, new conceptual lenses, new ways of thinking. So the writing process itself, and this is why some people have fear of the writing process. Fear of the writing process itself can be one of the biggest, blockages that you might encounter, because if you know that this is going to happen, maybe you feel paralyzed and you don't know how to begin. Well, that's why I talked about all those other possible little exercises that you could do to help work through that block. Okay. Let me put it this way. Don't leave, don't like really, really good, successful researchers, people who publish a lot. They don't leave things till the last minute. They start early. They write all the time. They write a little bit every single day, right? Because they know that the writing process will, like, oftentimes lead you in a different direction, right? They know that, and so they leave themselves the space and the time to allow for that kind of change in direction, right? So always make sure that, and then they're not afraid of the writing process, right? Okay, so now it's you finished the paper or the thesis, and now you're about to write the introduction. So you look for the three structural elements of an introduction. The first thing is you want to provide a contextualizing background. This is going to be especially important for a thesis, but also for, a good research paper as well. You want to provide a contextualizing background. So you establish unproblematic common ground or shared knowledge. So it is the case that such and such, something that kind of, pretty much everybody knows, but just sort of as an introduction into it. So, what's the context that you're going to be writing about? So just, discuss that first. Now, the extent of the contextualizing background should really be determined by who you envision your audience to be. If you put absolutely everything you know into it, and you're writing for a very advanced audience, you're going to look like you're an amateur. If you if you are writing as if you yourself already know a lot, and you're writing for an audience who already knows a lot, then you can leave a lot out. But if someone who doesn't know a lot already is reading it, like if you're, I don't know, if you're like this would be an extreme example, but let's say you're writing for um, an audience of advanced scientists, and you begin by talking about the mathematics times tables. I mean, that would be definitely too amateurish looking. Like that's assumed knowledge. You don't have to say everything. So the extent of how much background knowledge you put in is going to depend on who you think your audience is. If you put in too much for an advanced audience, you appear amateurish. If you don't put in enough for a less advanced audience, then maybe you're going to write above their head, sort of thing. So this is where you really have to be sensitive to your audience, right? And also, you might include a reference to a main source or two here. And we had talked before, back in the first video, when you're categorizing your notes, there's going to be some sources that are going to be very useful for just providing this contextualizing background. So this is where you're going to use some of those sources. Okay, then you want to disrupt that common ground. And this is going to give your introduction a little bit of drama. I mean, the idea is that you want to keep your reader engaged. You want to keep them interested. Otherwise, they're going to stop reading, right? They're going to read that introduction and going to say, well, that sounds boring. I'm not going to read any further. So you want to somehow catch their interest. So you provide the contextualizing background. Then you say, but here's a problem. This is something that has previously gone unnoticed, or there's a complication in this, or maybe we shouldn't think of it this way anymore, something like that, right? So state a problem which disrupts that common ground. And then state the consequences of not solving that problem. So in other words, that gives your reader an incentive to continue reading your paper with the idea that, well, you're going to solve that problem, right? And this then brings you back to the researcher role and the audience roles, right? So you might say, okay, here's some, interesting information, and then we all know how this fits into the common background, but there's an important question that, is coming up here, and I can help you to understand something better. Or think of this, there's a kind of a problem that's raising its head here, and I found a solution to that problem. So you want to somehow, in your disruption of the common ground, you want to somehow grip, use a little hook to grip your audience in so that you can keep them interested. And then the next step is to give your response to the problem. So if you think, for example, of an introduction, like often we think of an introduction as like one paragraph, then you get into the body of the paper. Actually, an introduction could be something like 3 paragraphs, or obviously much more, but at least 3. First paragraph, providing a contextualizing background, like it could be a section unto itself, right? Providing a contextualizing background, then disrupting the common ground, then you give your response to the problem. Now, there's kind of 2 ways that you could go here. You could simply promise an answer to the problem. You could say, okay, well, I'm going to solve that problem for you, or I've got an answer for that problem, but you don't say exactly what the problem is. You just sort of use that promise as a launching point in the introduction. Or you could very, very briefly provide the answer. Now, if you just sort of promise an answer, then I mean this it's kind of like an issue of control, right? If you just promise an answer, but you don't really give a hint of what it's going to be, then it might entice your audience, but it might sound also a bit contentious, like you're being kind of hotty totty sort of thing, right? But if you provide the answer very, very briefly, not fully, but extremely briefly, then you in some way allow your audience into your thinking a little bit more. And then they can, otherwise, you're not sort of leaving them on, like you're not baiting them along sort of thing. I mean, you do want to hook them, but you don't want to bait them, right? Because if your reader might feel manipulated otherwise. So just, try to get a feel in your own writing. Try to get a feel for how much you want to give away. Like if you give everything away at the end of the introduction, then the reader has no reason to continue reading the paper anyway. If you give a little bit away, then it's going to interest them and they're going to continue reading it. If you don't give anything away, if you just say, I've got the answer, keep reading sort of thing, then it sounds, like I say, kind of haughty and people might be put off by that, because they feel manipulated. So, I mean, it's a very subtle thing, but there can be those kinds of, feelings that the reader might experience depending on how much information you give them from the start. So just kind of, develop a sensitivity for something like that, right? And make sure you're not being off-putting in any way. Okay, now structural elements of a conclusion. Summarize your main point again. If you have already stated it in your introduction, this is where you're going to state it more fully, because they've seen, like you stated, you might have stated it just very briefly in your introduction, and then the body of the paper is you unfolding that line of thinking, engaging your sources, et cetera, so they see how your thinking is taking place. So state it more fully, incorporating the ideas that you've unfolded in the body of the paper. So don't just repeat it word for word, but make it more full. Okay. And then add a new significance. The conclusion should sort of point beyond the paper itself, right? So new significance should emerge from the argument as it unfolds. And this provides yet another answer to the so what question, right? So somebody asks you, what are you writing about? Well, I'm writing about, such and such a problem. Well, so what? Why is that important, right? There has to be some kind of significance that emerges from this argument. And that significance should be made explicit. You should point to it explicitly in the conclusion. And then point beyond itself further, indicate areas for further research. So articulate questions that are raised by your conclusion. And you don't have to answer those questions in the conclusion. The idea is that a paper answers certain questions already, and then the idea is that it should then raise further questions for a further paper or for further research, right? So articulate the questions that can then be followed up at a later point, either by you or by someone else. And by doing that, it actually puts you into a research community, right? If people feel as though you've answered an important question and then raised further questions, which then gives them an opportunity to explore those questions, they feel engaged by you, right? They feel called by you to enter into the community as well. So always try to feel yourself engaging in this kind of research community by doing this. So treat these questions not just as questions for you, but for members of your audience as well, who might themselves follow up on these new areas of research. Okay.